No way. He actually hit it. That'll be 25,000.
Dust tastes like copper when you're breathing hard. 25 grand sat on a folding table, waiting for anyone who could hit a 10-inch steel pendulum swinging at 800 yards. Everyone brought laser rangefinders and ballistic calculators. Alaric just brought a leather sling, iron sights, and bad knees. Gravel crunched under Alaric's boots, loud enough to make the dull hangover throb behind his left eye. He hadn't been drinking, just hadn't slept. Insomnia felt like a hangover these days, leaving the same metallic grit on his tongue and the same sour ache in his temples. He dragged his canvas drag bag across the dirt parking lot of the Desert Ridge shooting complex, ignoring the sharp twinge in his right shoulder. It was a torn rotator cuff from 30 years ago that never quite healed right. He didn't care. Pain was just background noise, like the high-pitched whine of the cicadas in the mesquite bushes. He stopped at the edge of the firing line. The air smelled of burnt gunpowder, hot brass, and cheap coconut sunscreen. 50 shooting bays stretched down the line, occupied by men 40 years his junior. They were draped in sponsored apparel, wearing wraparound sunglasses that looked like they belonged on a cyclist, and adjusting rifles that resembled space station components more than firearms. Carbon fiber barrels, machined aluminum chassis systems, and glass scopes that cost more than Alaric's rusted 2004 Ford Ranger. Alaric looked down at his own hands. Liver spots dotted the thin skin over his knuckles. His fingernails were thick, ridged with age, holding a faint crescent of engine grease he hadn't been able to scrub out. He flexed his fingers. They clicked. A dull, arthritic protest. At the center of the complex, beneath a white pop-up canopy, sat a clear acrylic box. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, $25,000. A tactical gear company out of Austin was throwing this promotional event. The rules were simple but cruel. One shot, cold bore, 800 yards. The target wasn't a static piece of steel. It was a 10-inch steel plate suspended by heavy chains from a crossbar. A mechanized arm gave the plate a shove every few seconds, keeping it in a constant, unpredictable swing. Hitting a 10-inch plate at 800 yards was difficult enough when the wind was dead calm. Hitting it while it moved like a pendulum in the swirling Nevada crosswinds was meant to be impossible. That was the point. It was supposed to generate engagement, social media clips of missed shots, and frustration. No one was actually supposed to win the money. Alaric needed that money. He didn't want it for a new truck, or a vacation, or to prove he was still the Marine who had walked point in the Ashau Valley in 1969. He wanted it because the property taxes on his 4 acres were due in 3 weeks. He wanted it because his wife's medical debt, the leftover bills from the hospice care that Medicare hadn't bothered to cover before she died last November, was sitting in a stack on his kitchen counter, thick as a phone book. Collection agencies were calling his landline 5 times a day. Their voices were aggressively polite. Alaric hated polite aggression. "Hey, Pops, you lost?" Alaric turned his head. A kid in his late 20s, sporting a neatly trimmed beard and a shirt plastered with logos, was leaning against a customized rifle rack. The kid's name tag said Blake. He held a device that looked like a cell phone, hooked up to a tiny fan, a Kestrel wind meter. "Looking for lane 42, Alaric said. His voice was gravelly, dry as the dirt underfoot. "Down there by the trash cans," Blake said, smirking slightly as his eyes dropped to the canvas bag in Alaric's hand. "You shooting in the vintage class? They ran that yesterday. Today's the open money." "I know what today is," Alaric replied. He didn't elaborate. He didn't feel the need to explain himself to a boy whose hands had never been blistered by anything rougher than a PlayStation controller. Alaric walked down to lane 42. He unzipped the heavy canvas bag. The zipper snagged halfway, and he had to yank it hard, tearing the fabric slightly. He cursed under his breath. He reached in and pulled out a heavy length of wood and steel. It was a 1903, a 3 Springfield. It wasn't a pristine collector's piece. The walnut stock was bruised and gouged, dark with decades of sweat and linseed oil. The bluing on the barrel had long since worn away to a dull, mottled gray. There was no scope, just a front blade sight and a rear peep aperture. A heavy leather M1907 sling was looped around the front swivel, the leather cracked but supple from recent oiling. The guy in the next lane over, a heavy-set man named Davis with a $4,000 spotting scope, stopped adjusting his dials and stared. "You're shooting iron sights?" Davis asked, his tone hanging somewhere between amusement and genuine disbelief. "At 800? On a moving target?" "That's the distance," Alaric said, laying the rifle on the shooting mat. He didn't look up. He started threading his left arm through the leather sling, adjusting the keepers. The leather dug into his bicep. It felt familiar, tight, a restriction that brought order to the chaos of his aging muscles. "You can't even see a 10-inch plate at 800 yards without magnification," Davis chuckled, shaking his head. "The front sight post will completely cover it." "I don't need to see it to know where it is," Alaric muttered. He pushed a 5-round stripper clip of 30-06 ammunition into the receiver, pressing the brass cartridges down into the internal magazine with his thumb. The action closed with a heavy, satisfying metallic clack. He sat back on his heels, the joints in his knees screaming in protest, and looked out across the desert. The heat was already rising, baking the moisture out of the scrub brush. The smell of sage and hot dust hung thick in the air. He was tired, deeply, fundamentally tired. He wanted to be back on his porch, drinking cheap coffee from a chipped mug, listening to the morning news. Instead, he was here, surrounded by arrogance and loud noises, relying on a 70-year-old rifle to buy his peace. Waiting was always the hardest part. Alaric sat on an overturned plastic bucket he'd found near the trash cans. The sun beat down on the back of his neck, prickling his skin. He didn't wear a hat. The brim got in the way of his sight picture. The range officers were cycling through the shooters one by one. The rules dictated that each shooter had 2 minutes to get into position, glass the wind, and take their single shot. Crack! Whoosh! A suppressed 6.5 Creedmoor fired 3 lanes down. Alaric watched the dust kick up on the berm behind the swinging plate. "Miss," the spotter called out over the megaphone. A collective groan rippled through the onlookers. The shooter packed his gear, slamming his Pelican case shut in frustration. Alaric watched the mechanics of the misses. It wasn't the distance defeating these kids. It was their reliance on the screens. They were staring at their ballistic calculators, punching in the barometric pressure, the humidity, the Coriolis effect. They were treating the shot like a math equation. But a swinging plate in a shifting crosswind wasn't an equation. It was a rhythm. It was an instinct. The wind out here didn't read weather apps. It blew down from the ridge, funneled through a shallow draw at 400 yards, and then hit a wall of heat rising from the baked clay at 600 yards, creating a localized updraft. You couldn't measure it from the firing line. You had to look at the world. Alaric narrowed his eyes, squinting against the harsh glare. His eyes watered, blurring his vision. He blinked hard, squeezing a tear down his weathered cheek. He ignored it. He watched the mirage. The heat waves boiled off the desert floor. Most people saw mirage as an annoyance, a distortion that ruined their expensive optical clarity. Alaric saw it as a map. Right now, the mirage at the 300-yard mark was leaning hard to the right, flowing like a fast river. But out near the target, at 800, the Mirage was standing straight up, boiling. That meant the wind died completely in the last 200 yards. If a shooter dialed his scope for the heavy crosswind at the firing line, his bullet would drift too far by the time it hit the dead zone at the target. Shooter 41 to the line, the PA system crackled. Davis, the heavy-set man next to Alaric, lowered himself onto his mat. He spent 90 seconds twisting the turrets on his scope. He breathed in, held it, and broke the shot. The massive muzzle brake redirected the escaping gases backward, slapping Alaric in the face with a wave of hot, acrid air. Dust coated Alaric's teeth. He swallowed the grit. Miss. Left edge, the spotter announced. Davis cursed loudly, pounding his fist against the dirt. The wind meter said, "Full value." He yelled, at no one in particular. Shooter 42 to the line, the voice boomed. Alaric stood up. His lower back locked for a second, a sharp stab of nerve pain shooting down his left leg. He took a short, shallow breath, waited for the spasm to pass, and stepped forward. The crowd that had been murmuring grew quiet. A few people pulled out their phones. It was a spectacle. The old man with the antique stick, about to make a fool of himself for the internet. Alaric dropped to his knees. The impact sent a jolt up his shins. He placed his left hand, bound tight in the leather sling, on the mat, and eased his chest to the ground. It was an ugly, ungraceful movement. He looked like an old dog trying to settle into a cold, hard floor. He wriggled his hips, driving the toes of his boots into the dust, aligning his spine with the natural point of aim. He pulled the heavy stock into the pocket of his shoulder. The wood was warm. It smelled faintly of gun oil and old brass. "Shooter has 2 minutes," the rangemaster, a stout man with a clipboard, said from behind him. His tone was softer than it had been for the others. Pity. Alaric hated that tone. It made his jaw clench. He didn't want pity. He wanted his $25,000. He placed his cheek on the comb of the stock. The world narrowed down to the rear aperture, a tiny, blurry circle. He focused his eye on the front sight post. It was a thick black blade, sharp against the blinding glare of the desert. He found the target. Davis was right. At this distance, the 10-inch plate was entirely hidden behind the front sight post. If he aimed directly at it, he wouldn't be able to see it at all. He didn't aim at it. He shifted his body a fraction of an inch to the right. He aimed at the empty air to the side of the steel plate. He watched the heavy chains swing. Clank. Swoosh. Clank. He could almost hear the heavy metal groaning, even though it was half a mile away. It was a metronome, left to right to left. He checked the Mirage again. The wind was picking up at the firing line, brushing cold against the sweat on his neck. But out at the target, the grass was still. He had to aim high for the drop. He had to aim right for the wind. And he had to time the trigger brake perfectly, so the bullet traveling for over a second through the air would intersect with a piece of steel that wouldn't be there until the exact moment the bullet arrived. His breathing slowed. The throb in his shoulder faded. The headache receded. There was no crowd. There was no debt. There was only the front post, the heat waves, and the rhythm of a pendulum. His finger curled around the cold, curved steel of the trigger. It was a 2-stage trigger. He pulled it back gently, taking up the slack until he hit the firm wall of the second stage. 3 pounds of pressure stood between him and the shot. A drop of sweat broke from his eyebrow, stinging his eye. He didn't blink. He couldn't afford to break his focus. The pendulum swung right. It reached its apex, hanging suspended in the air for a microscopic fraction of a second before gravity pulled it back. Alaric held his breath. If Alaric's gritty reality struck a chord with you, drop a like and share this video with someone who appreciates the raw, unfiltered truth of the old school. We're telling stories about real grit, not Hollywood myths. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss parts 3 and 4 where the trigger finally breaks. What would you do for 25 grand? Let us know in the comments below. Sweat stung his left eye, pooling in the deep wrinkles radiating from the corner. Alaric kept his eye open. The human body is a machine that constantly betrays you. Muscles twitch, lungs demand oxygen, hearts hammer against ribs, sending microscopic tremors through the skeleton. You can't stop the tremors. You have to trap them. He pulled the rifle tighter into the pocket of his shoulder, letting the sling bear the agonizing weight of his upper body. The leather strap groaned, biting deep into his bicep, cutting off the circulation. His fingers went numb. Good. Numb fingers couldn't flinch. Through the tiny rear peep sight, the world was a hazy, vibrating circle of beige and brown. He wasn't looking at the plate anymore. He was looking at a patch of empty space where the plate was going to be. The wind was a physical weight against his right side, gusting hard enough to rustle the canvas of his drag bag. The pendulum swung. Left, right. It was a heavy, lumbering arc. The mechanized arm shoved it, and the heavy chains fought gravity. At the absolute edge of its swing, there was a dead spot, a fraction of a heartbeat where the steel plate stopped moving away and hadn't yet started falling back. That was the window. It was maybe 1/10 of a second wide. Alaric exhaled. He pushed the air out of his lungs slowly, letting his diaphragm collapse. He reached the natural respiratory pause, that empty space at the bottom of a breath, where the body briefly accepts the stillness of death. His heartbeat thumped heavily against the desert floor. Thump, wait, thump, wait. The plate hit the right side apex. Alaric added the last 3 pounds of pressure to the curved steel shoe of the trigger. He didn't yank it. He commanded it. The sear broke. A 70-year-old firing pin slammed forward, striking the brass primer of the 30-06 cartridge. The chemical reaction was instantaneous. Inside the chamber, powder ignited, expanding violently, pushing a .175 grain boat tail hollow point bullet down 24 inches of rifled steel. The rifle roared. It was a concussive, deafening crack that punched through Alaric's cheap foam earplugs. The recoil was a brutal, physical assault. The bare steel butt plate slammed into his bad shoulder with the force of a swinging hammer. Pain flared white-hot, shooting down his collarbone and radiating into his neck. His teeth clamped together, grinding hard enough to make his jaw ache. The muzzle whipped upward, jumping off the target, instantly destroying his sight picture. A cloud of fine, powdery dust billowed up around him, kicked into the air by the muzzle blast. He didn't scramble to look. He couldn't see anything anyway. The recoil had thrown him out of alignment. He just lay there, his cheek resting against the warm, vibrating walnut stock. The bullet was gone. It was out of his hands, traveling at 2,700 feet per second across a hostile, shifting landscape. Time dilated. At 800 yards, a bullet takes almost a full 1.5 seconds to reach the target. In the realm of human reflexes, 1.5 seconds is an eternity. It's enough time to doubt yourself, enough time to replay the trigger pull and realize you snatched it, enough time to feel the wind shift against your back and know with sickening certainty that the gust just pushed your bullet 3 feet off course. Alaric stared at the dirt an inch from his nose. A single black ant was climbing over a pebble. He thought about the kitchen table. He thought about the stack of envelopes with red final notice stamps across the front. He remembered the smell of the rubbing alcohol they used to wipe down Sarah's arms before the morphine injections. the way her skin had felt like fragile, translucent parchment in the final days. The terrible, deafening quiet of the house after the paramedics finally zipped the bag and rolled the gurney down the front steps. He needed this shot. He didn't want the glory. He just wanted the collections people to stop calling. He wanted to sit on his porch and listen to the cicadas without feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of debt sitting on his chest. The silence hanging over the firing line was absolute. Every eye was locked on the spotters, on the digital screens, on the heavy glass lenses pointed downrange. Then it came. It wasn't a loud, ringing bell. At half a mile, the sound of a copper-jacketed lead projectile striking hardened AR-500 steel is faint. It's a dull, flat thwack, a subtle, metallic groan that gets swallowed by the vastness of the desert and the wind. But the spotter saw it. Impact, the spotter said. His voice, amplified through the megaphone, lacked its usual robotic cadence. It sounded hollow, shocked, center punch, dead center. Nobody cheered. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clanking of the mechanized arm resetting the pendulum. Alaric didn't jump up. He couldn't have, even if he wanted to. His lower back was a knot of screaming nerves, and his right shoulder throbbed with a dull, nauseating ache. He slowly rotated the bolt handle upward. The action was stiff, coated in a fine layer of desert grit. He pulled it back, and the extractor flung the empty brass casing onto the dirt. The casing clinked against a rock. It smoked faintly, smelling of burnt cordite and hot metal. A smell Alaric had known intimately since he was 19 years old, shivering in a monsoon downpour halfway across the world. He unwrapped the leather sling from his arm. His bicep was deeply indented, the skin white where the blood had been squeezed out. As circulation returned, it felt like 1,000 tiny needles prickling his flesh. He planted his left hand in the dirt and pushed himself up. His knees popped loudly. He swayed for a second, a head rush darkening the edges of his vision. He stood there, leaning heavily on the battered Springfield like a walking stick, waiting for the world to stop spinning. Davis, the heavy-set man in the next lane, was staring at him, his mouth slightly open. The $4,000 spotting scope sat abandoned on its tripod. "You," Davis started, swallowed, and tried again. "You hit it. Iron sights." Alaric didn't look at him. He bent down, moving with agonizing slowness, and picked up the spent brass casing. He slipped it into his breast pocket. He always kept his brass. It was a habit born of poverty. Back when reloading your own ammunition was the only way you could afford to shoot. "Yeah," Alaric grunted. His voice was hoarse from the dust. Blake, the bearded kid with the logos and the wind meter, came jogging down the line. He looked panicked, like a script had just been violently torn up in front of him. He carried a digital camera mounted on a stabilization gimbal. Hold up, Blake said, breathless, aiming the lens at Alaric's face. "Sir, that was unbelievable. Can you tell the camera what you were feeling when you broke that shot? What optic are you running?" "Wait, you're not running an optic. How did you compensate for the spin drift?" Alaric stared at the black eye of the camera lens. He felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. He didn't want to explain ballistics to a kid who treated rifles like luxury watches. He didn't want to talk about his feelings. He just wanted his check. "I felt the trigger," Alaric said flatly. He pushed the barrel of the Springfield down, ensuring the muzzle was pointed safely at the dirt, and started walking toward the white pop-up canopy. The crowd parted for him. The arrogant smirks were gone, replaced by a confused, almost reverent quiet. The guys in the sponsored jerseys watched him pass, their eyes dropping to the bruised, oil-stained wood of his rifle. Alaric ignored them. He limped slightly, his left leg stiff, dragging his canvas bag behind him. The rangemaster was standing beside the acrylic box, holding a clipboard. He looked at Alaric, then down at the stacks of $100 bills, then back up at Alaric. He looked like a man who had just been forced to swallow a lemon. Lane 42, the rangemaster said, clearing his throat. Impact confirmed. Cold bore. The money, Alaric said. He didn't phrase it as a question. The rangemaster nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. He unlocked the padlock on the side of the acrylic box. The lid swung open with a cheap plastic squeak. "We usually do a big presentation," the rangemaster said, glancing nervously at Blake, who was still hovering with his camera. A giant novelty check. Handshakes. Pictures for the company Instagram. "I don't do pictures," Alaric replied. He slung the heavy Springfield over his left shoulder, wincing as the leather strap dug into his collarbone. He reached into the box. The paper bands holding the stacks of hundreds felt crisp and artificial. He pulled them out, one by one, stuffing them into the deep pockets of his faded canvas field jacket. The jacket bulged awkwardly, the hard edges of the cash digging into his ribs. $25,000 didn't take up as much space as he thought it would. It just felt heavy. Blake stepped closer, lowering the camera slightly. "Seriously, man, what's your secret? What app were you using for your dope?" Alaric paused. He looked at Blake. He saw the desperation for a hack, a shortcut, a piece of software that could replace decades of muscle memory and hard lessons. "The wind blows, kid," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. "You just have to watch where the grass bends." He turned his back on the canopy, on the cameras, and on the crowd of modern marksmen. He walked back toward his rusted Ford Ranger. The sun was directly overhead now, beating down mercilessly, turning the inside of his truck into an oven. He opened the squeaking door and tossed the canvas drag bag onto the passenger seat. He climbed in, the hot vinyl seat burning through his thin denim jeans. He didn't start the engine right away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single stack of $100 bills, and stared at it. The green ink looked incredibly bright against the grime on his fingers. He thumbed the edge of the paper. It was enough. It was enough to pay off the hospital. It was enough to pay the county tax assessor. It was enough to buy him another year of quiet on his 4 acres. Alaric let out a long, ragged breath. He leaned his head back against the cracked window, closing his eyes. His shoulder throbbed. His back ached. His hands still smelled like brass and burnt gunpowder. He was $25,000 richer. But as he sat alone in the sweltering heat of the parking lot, listening to the muffled crack of rifles firing in the distance, Alaric knew the hard truth. He had won the money, but he hadn't won anything back. The house would still be empty when he got home. The silence would still be there, waiting for him. He turned the key in the ignition. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life, shaking the entire frame of the truck. Alaric shifted it into gear and drove slowly out of the dirt lot, leaving a trail of dust to settle over the empty desert. He didn't look back in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind him worth seeing. There it is, the raw truth of lead meeting steel. Alaric didn't win with a ballistic app or a $5,000 scope. He won because he understood the language of the wind and the silence of an empty house. If this story hit you where it counts, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who respects the old ways. Leave a comment below. Would you have trusted the iron sights or reached for the glass?